Welcome to RHI Sociable City Interviews, where we meet with global thought leaders on nightlife and the social economy. Today we are with John Samuel, CEO and co-founder ABLR 360. So I'm with John Samuel. We met when I was in Raleigh, and then we've kind of become associated with each other, and he was a speaker for us in our Seattle summit. And I had an opportunity to interview him and learn more about things that I hadn't thought about, particularly for the blind community. And so we're here to talk about the evolution of his thinking and what he's observed and what he thinks might be possible as we move forward in revitalizing our social spaces, particularly in terms of accessibility for people with disabilities. But John, one of the main questions I want to ask you to start off with is, how do you see the many changes, the adaptive changes that cities are taking to expand outdoor seating, allow for take home food, home deliveries from restaurants, even being able to order a mixed cocktail and have it delivered to your home? How has this kind of application of these new services of benefit to the disability community, and in particular, the community that you represent, the people who are blind or with visual impairments?
No, thank you so much, Jim, for having me here. And that's a great question. When I think about what the current situation with things now being a takeout society or a home delivery, it actually benefits the disability community in many ways because previously there was a lot of restaurants that weren't available on Uber Eats or any of these other meal delivery applications, but now a lot of the restaurants have opened up, and now people who previously were not able to order these type of foods are now getting exposed to a greater selection of cuisine. And so, even the cocktails, a lot of people with disabilities and who are blind in particular may not have ventured out. And so often when we go to a restaurant or a bar, we just didn't know what was available. And so we often would ask, or at least in my own case, ask the waiter or, what are your suggestions? But all of a sudden now that all these menus are available online in a digital format, which in many cases may be accessible, we're not sure. But if they are, then we're now able to see and open up to a whole new selection of things, which is really promising. And I think one of the silver linings of our current situation.
I wanted to ask you about that because I know there was a discussion before when we first met in Raleigh about restaurants that promoted their menus online, but they weren't accessible for people who had visual impairments.
Yeah.
And that there was lawsuits that were coming about because of that. Do you feel that this is, in a way, helping to modernize the online menu in ways that didn't exist before the pandemic?
In many cases, the accessibility issue is still there. I think it's even more challenging in terms of accessibility because individuals who previously did not have a web experience quickly went and put up a quick, cheap website or use PDFs to put their websites on and thinking that it's accessible, but they're not. And so right now, that's one of the things we're really trying to do is help restaurants and nightlife providers to ensure that their menus and their information is accessible. And that is something that is even more important today because now that's where our primary source of information is. And even when we go back into the restaurants, having that access to the websites and the menus and content is going to be even more important. So that's why it's even more important to make sure that it is accessible.
Yeah, because I even noticed, like when I go into a restaurant, I went to one restaurant where they have a QR code that you
Yeah.
shoot your phone at, and then it comes up with their menu. But it was a PDF of their menu. So I thought about you and I thought, oh, well, here's a technology. But first, you have to be able to know that the menu is on a QR code, and then you have to be able to adjust your phone to get that. And then you have to be able to read the menu because otherwise you don't have that resource. Um, we also kind of talked a little bit about how the disability community often becomes socially isolated.
Yeah.
either because venues, while they may be technically accessible, often have the attitudinal barriers to people with disabilities going out. Um, and so there was a sense of social isolation in some cases. Do you feel that this pandemic and the way that just generally everybody is becoming more homebound with home entertainment, with big screen TVs or super sound systems
Yeah.
and home delivery from fancy restaurants, do you think that's changing how people with disabilities socialize, or do you think it's creating even more barriers?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question, Jim. I can only speak from my own perspective on this side, um, because I think that there is a feeling that everyone else is in the same boat. You know, I often felt that I was restricted because of my lack, because I'm blind and I had a lack of mobility in terms of getting to different places. So in many cases, if I wasn't able to go out with a friend or, um, you know, or different circumstances in regards to transportation, I would stay at home often. But now everyone's at home and there's this feeling of like, well, I'm not missing out on anything because everyone's at home. And so you kind of have that feeling that, you know, it was actually an easier transition for me than my wife. My wife, who is sighted and has that freedom of going anywhere she wants, she's now restricted.
Mhm.
Where I didn't have that feeling of, oh, I can no longer go out because I couldn't before. I had already kind of gone through that um, kind of that adjustment period when I was losing my sight. And so I think the transition for me personally was much easier than my wife who's sighted. But I think that one of the things that we're seeing is a lot of people who are dating now. A lot of times are having that first encounter, that first date on a Zoom meeting or and that type of online interaction. And I think that really bodes well for people who are blind or have a disability who don't necessarily want to disclose that on the first date, but to get to
Mhm.
know somebody and share kind of in those the real things that make us all interested in one another and not focus on the disability. So I think there's some benefits that there are for people with disabilities. But again, I think for myself, I'd rather right now not take an Uber just if I don't need to expose myself. And so that type of thing now keeps me more restricted at home, a
I
little
know
bit
when
more
we
isolation.
spoke, you were speaking about how Uber in particular and Lyft with their phone apps made it easier for you to get a
Yeah.
ride and go out more. But you're saying now that you have some concerns about getting into the cars because of the fear. And as we mentioned before we got online here, that people with disabilities may be at higher risk because of underlying conditions. So the
Yeah.
fear of going out is even more exaggerated than just the attitudinal barriers that they faced.
Mentioning is that in many cases for somebody who's blind, our hands are often our eyes. So there's a lot of touching and we feel around. So when I first met you, Jim, remember we were at the bar and I was feeling around the bar to find my drink. And so now if I'm touching around and then you know putting my hands anywhere else, it's there's more exposure to my hands being touching things. And that's something I
Mm.
want to be cautious about. And so if I am going into an Uber, I don't know I can't see and notice if there's anything I don't want to touch. But those are the type of things. And again, many people who have disabilities may have underlying conditions that may put them at a higher risk. And so um, I'm not just alone in that kind of fear.
Now, the growth of outdoor seating where they're kind of having these makeshift areas and also, it's along the curb line. And, have you seen any focus or any kind of policy that's coming out with the guidelines for creating these outdoor spaces that will be accommodating people with disabilities? Or do you feel that has kind of fallen by the wayside as it relates to this outdoor seating experience?
One of the things I did read about previously was about ramps that were being put up as a result of these um, more sidewalk seating for restaurants. And so that's really good for people with mobility challenges who now have ramps. But from a person with a visual impairment, one of the things is that I can't see if they've now blocked off a road. And so I think it gets really more important for those wayfinding mobile apps, such as
Mhm.
Google Maps or a map that I'm using now called Good Maps. It's important that these type of mapping system or wayfinding systems are aware of road closures or sidewalk closures so that we know that we're not going to be walking into somebody's meal or into a barrier that previously 6 months ago wasn't there. And that
Mhm.
because we often get used to our own um, routes. And now, 6 months later, we haven't been out on the roads. There may be a whole new structure. And that's why it's really important for us to make sure that that's indicated in the different mobile apps that we're using and also on the website. So let people know that we are now blocking off these roads. So that really comes down to those downtown associations. So really be kind of being cognizant of that and being aware of updating that information as and when they have that information.
How do you envision the future? I mean, how do you think things could change that might make all of this a better world for people with disabilities? What are some potential um, outcomes that may not have happened if we didn't have to struggle through this current moment?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of silver linings that have come out of this. One is that in many ways, we've found that many service jobs, in terms of office jobs that were previously believed that they could not be done at home and they had to be done within the four walls of an office, we're now finding that they can be done at home. And that opens up a lot more employment opportunities for people with disabilities who face transportation challenges. I think from a nightlife perspective, I think the accessibility to new restaurants and new types of foods that people previously weren't able uh, to access, maybe because they didn't know what they couldn't read the menus before, or they couldn't um, get into the restaurants. This now opens up a whole new space for people to try different different things in their own communities. And I think finally it kind of goes back to that dating aspect. I think that we can now have there is a possibility of having more open relationships and conversations um, through online interactions that then could lead to real friendships outside when we're not focused on somebody's ability, but focusing on the person himself. And so I think there are some good things out there.
Well, good. That's a great summation. I think it provides a nice framework for the future, and also I think could indicate how the disability community is ultimately going to become an even greater potential consumer of sociability and dining and entertainment once we're all able to get back out and experience those things. So I appreciate your taking the time and look forward to working with you. And I'm going to conclude this recording.
Thanks, Jim.